Thus far in our series, we've talked about Moses' childhood and the faith that we saw in his parents. We've noted his struggles as a young man, trying to find his place in the world, where he fit in and what he was supposed to be doing. We've noted his call back to Egypt, and he didn't want to go, tried to exempt himself from that, but he ended up going. And then dealing with the struggles when he got back there. The doubts of his own people, hatred from his own people, eventually standing against God or against Pharaoh, God backing him in that and leading the people out. And so last week we saw that he had led them out and they were brought to freedom. They were led through the Red Sea and given victory over the Egyptian army in that. And we had concluded with what is commonly referred to as the Song of Moses. They got up on the other side of the Red Sea and they sang along with Moses, exalting God because of their victory. They talked about God's power. They talked about his holiness, his mercy, his redemption, his guidance. They were ready to take on the world, in fact. Chapter 15, verse 14 and 15 says, "Sorrow will take hold of the inhabitants of Philistia." Remember, God wasn't even going to take them that way. He was afraid of how they might respond if he took them through Philistia, and so he didn't take them that way. But sorrow will take hold of the inhabitants of Philistia. The chiefs of Edom will be dismayed. The mighty men of Moab, trembling, will take hold of them. All the inhabitants of Canaan will melt away. That's the kind of confidence they have when they're standing there on the edge of the Red Sea, having seen the Egyptians destroyed by God. They anticipated the Lord establishing them in the land of inheritance. And this is good. I'm glad that they had that kind of confidence. But then the song finished. And after the song was done, it seems as though the confidence just faded away. They allowed fear to trump faith, and their concerns outweighed their confidence. And so that's where we pick up today. In the latter part of chapter 15, they have gone 3 days' journey from the Red Sea, and a downward spiral of complaining now begins. And so here they are, verse 22 and 23. Moses brought them from the Red Sea, and they went into the wilderness of Shur, and they'd gone 3 days in the wilderness. They found no water. When they came to Marah, they could not drink the waters of Marah, for they were bitter. Therefore, the name of it was called Marah, which means bitter. And so what do they do? Now, it'd be nice in verse 24 if we saw this. The people wondered and asked Moses, what should we drink? What's God have in store for us next? I wonder what good thing he's going to do now. They were in amazement maybe, or wondered. That's not what it says. What it does say is the people complained against Moses, saying, what shall we drink? God just brought them out of the land of Egypt with a great victory. Do you not think he can deal with a little bit of bitter water and take care of that? And so what we find then in the next few verses, the Lord provides water for them. Verse 25, Moses cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree. When he cast it into the water was made sweet. God solves their problem. But notice we're told as we keep on reading in the text that this was a test. The latter part of verse 25, there he made a statute and an ordinance for them, and there he tested them and said, if you diligently heed the voice of the Lord your God and do what is right in his sight, give ear to his commandment and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you which I have brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you. It's a test. But the lack of potable water when they arrive at Marah is a test. And may I say to you, they failed the test. Rather than asking of God, who they just acknowledged in the Song of Moses that he is powerful and holy and merciful and redemptive and guiding. rather than ask the one who has all those qualities and more, Lord, could we have some water that we could drink? They complained. They didn't react in faith. What happened to the people who were singing about how the Philistines are going to run and how the people of Edom are going to be terrified and how the heart of all the Canaanites are going to melt? They can't even ask for a cup of water from the God that they expect to do all this. And so in verse 26, he gives this statute that we've got on the screen here. And I want you to understand, we could look at this and we could think, oh, this is a promise. This is not a promise. That's not how this is given. This is part of the test as well. They failed the first part, which dealt with the water. But listen to what he says. If you diligently heed the voice of the Lord your God and do what is right in his sight, give ear to his commandments and keep his statute, I will put none of the diseases on you which I have brought on the Egyptians. That's not a promise. That's God giving a warning. Think about what the flip side of it is. If you don't diligently heed the voice of the Lord your God and do what is right in his sight, and if you don't give ear to his commandments and don't keep his statutes, disease is going to come upon you. That's the flip side of this statement. And so this is a warning. The diseases that were brought upon Egypt were brought upon them because of their sin, because of their arrogance, because they would not heed the voice of the Lord. And God says to his own people, you're not immune from that. If you will refuse to listen to me, then I'm going to cause you to be scattered in the wilderness dead. You know what happens to this generation, right? That's the very thing that will happen. This is not a good start after the Lord brought them up out of bondage. Complaining. All right, well, we'll move on and we'll come on into chapter 16. Chapter 16 is where we're introduced to the manna. The Hebrews continue on their way toward Mount Sinai. That's the eventual goal here, and they're going to go and receive the law there. But look at verse 3 in chapter 16. Again, they find something to complain about. Oh, that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the pots of meat, and when we ate bread to the full. For you brought us out into this wilderness to kill us, or to kill this whole assembly with hunger. When they left Egypt, I suspect that they had some food supplies, and that they were rationing that as they went along the way. And it seems that their supply is running low. And so again, the logical thing to do in this case, did they not learn anything from what happened at Marah? The logical thing to do in this would simply be to ask of God. And if God is powerful and holy and merciful and redemptive and guiding, then presumably he might provide some food for them too. But what they find to do instead is complain. Oh, that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt. Think about that for a moment. They're not even saying, oh, that we had died as slaves in Egypt at the hand of Pharaoh. Oh, that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt. Remember the whole Passover deal? He redeemed their firstborns in that. They're saying, oh, God should have just got rid of all of us if he's going to bring us out here and not provide food. What, did you ask him for food? It's just that simple. Didn't Jesus say something about that? That he who asks receives. He who knocks, the door will be open. They're not going to ask. Did they forget what Egypt was like? You know, as I read through this part of Exodus and on over into the book of Numbers, it just seems like they've forgotten what Egypt was really like. They talk about all the good things, the food and so forth in Egypt. Did they forget that they were slaves? Did they forget that the Egyptians caused them to serve with rigor? That it was difficult. Did they forget that there were times in Egypt's history where Egypt sought to kill their firstborn sons or all of their sons? And God brought them away from that. He destroyed the Egyptians in the Red Sea. He provided potable water at Marah. I think he can give some food. It amazes me, both in the end of chapter 15 and in chapter 16, the restraint that God has. In neither case do we see God striking out against them and doing any harm whatsoever. At the end of chapter 15, it was just simply a warning. He gives them the water they need, but he gives them a warning. Here in chapter 16, he's gracious in how he deals with them. They speak out in faithlessness, and he responds by showing his faithfulness. And so he's going to provide some food for them. Verse 4, then the Lord said to Moses, behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a certain quota every day, that I may test them whether they will walk in my law or not. Again, this is a test. I want to find out if they're actually going to obey what I say for them to do. And so I'm going to give them some food. I'm going to rain bread from heaven. Verse 5, it shall be on the 6th day that they shall prepare what they bring in, and it shall be twice as much as they gather daily. So he's now preparing them for the Sabbath. You see, the Sabbath day, there's not going to be any manna out on the ground. And so for 6 days, God's going to provide manna, and they're going to collect. And on the 6th day, they're supposed to collect a double portion so that they'll have enough for the Sabbath as well. Drop down in the text, look at verse 8. It says, also Moses said, this shall be seen when the Lord gives you meat to eat in the evening, and in the morning bread to the full. For the Lord hears your complaints, which you make against him. And what are you? Your complaints are not against us, but against the Lord. A couple things in that verse. First of all, God's going to give you what you need. You didn't even ask. You complained about it, but God's going to give you what you need. In fact, he's going to provide some variety. In the evening, you're going to get meat. That'll be the quail that's going to come. And then in the morning, you're going to get bread. God is going to provide the things that you need at all times. But let me talk to you about how you approach this. And he makes sure that they understand your complaint was not against me. It wasn't against Aaron. You were complaining against the Creator. You were complaining against the Lord. Is it really a wise thing to complain against the Lord? Now, to this point, let me say to you that they have gotten away with it twice. God did not strike back at them in chapter 15. He simply provided what they needed. Here in chapter 16, he did not strike out at them in chapter 16. He provided them what they needed. He is being patient right now. But how long should somebody wear on God's patience? And so he wants them to consider their ways. Verse 10, Aaron spoke to the congregation, and as he did so, we're told that the Lord appeared there. It came to pass as Aaron spoke to the whole congregation of the children of Israel, and they looked toward the wilderness, and behold, the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud. Just a reminder for them that God is still there. Remember when they were coming up out of Egypt, there was the cloud, pillar of cloud during the day, pillar of fire during the night. As they crossed over through the Red Sea, the cloud was there as well. This is, again, a reminder that God's with you. And so you need to have the kind of faith that you ought to have, not be in doubt as you are. Verse 12 through 14, the Lord instructed Moses concerning what he was about to do. And so at twilight, meat would be provided. We're told, verse 13, that it's going to be quail that will come up in the evening and cover the camp. And this is what the people are going to have to eat. And then in the morning, bread is going to be provided. It's called manna. That's what it's going to be referred to. Notice in verse 15, the children of Israel, it says, when the children of Israel saw it, they said to one another, what is it? You ever seen bread fall out of heaven? This is sort of a different thing, right? And so they asked the question, what is it? For they did not know what it was. Moses said to them, this is the bread which the Lord has given you to eat. Now, the word manna literally means, what is it? That became its name. They called it manna, which is what is it? The Lord instructs them, verse 16, about how much manna they are to gather. And I didn't look up the details to know exactly how much a omer is. We're told at the end of the chapter, omer is 1/10 of an ephah, but if you don't know what an ephah is, then that didn't help you any. But it is a suitable portion for one individual. That's how much an omer is. So however much it would be that an individual might eat through the day of this, that is the appropriate portion. And so God instructs them about gathering. If you've got larger families, then you're going to gather more. And if you've got smaller families, you're going to gather less. Basically, an omer per person is what you ought to gather, somewhere in that range. Gather according to your need. Verse 19, there is a warning. Moses said, let no one leave any of it till morning. You gather for the day and you eat that day and don't leave it over till the morning. In fact, they were told the same thing about the Passover back in Egypt. Don't leave any of it till the morning. Gather what you need and eat what you need. Do not gather more than what you need. Use what you've got. Look at verse 20. Notwithstanding, they did not heed Moses. Again, do you remember God said this was a test to see if they will actually keep his commandments or not? And how difficult of a test is this? Go out, and if you've got 5 people in your family, gather 5 omers of bread and take it home and eat it. Is that really very difficult? And yet some of them did not heed Moses, but some of them left part of it until morning, and it bred worms and stank. And Moses was angry with them. You know, I think a 2-year-old could obey that. You give a 2-year-old a pot, fill that up. Don't fill 2 pots, just 1 pot. They couldn't even obey this simple command. Look at verse 22. So it was on the 6th day that they gathered twice as much bread, that's what they're supposed to do, 2 omers for each one, and all the rulers of the congregation came and told Moses. Then he said to them, this is what the Lord has said. Tomorrow is a Sabbath rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake today, and boil what you will boil, and lay up for yourselves all that remains to be kept until morning. So on the 6th day, things are a little bit different. You need to leave a day's worth of manna for the next day. Go ahead and cook it up and just leave it. And it's not going to breed worms and it's not going to stink the next morning, because God has said tomorrow is going to be a Sabbath. Tomorrow is a rest. This was the next day's provision. Verse 27. Now it happened that some of the people went out on the 7th day to gather, but they found none. Anyone else just sort of shaking your head at this and wondering, how could they be so dumb? How is it that they, such simple commands, and they're not, the word isn't even able. The word is willing. They're not willing to obey what God says. And so verse 28. Here's God's question to Moses, and it's not specifically about Moses, it's about the whole nation. How long do you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws? He hasn't even given them the 10 commandments yet. He hasn't given them the 613 laws of the Old Testament. All he has said to them thus far is, go and gather an omer per person for day 1 through 5, and then gather 2 omers per person on day 6. How hard is that? It just baffles the mind that people could be this ignorant, arrogant, dense. I don't know what the right word is. But it's definitely not faithful. In verse 33, we're told that Moses said to Aaron, "Take a pot, put an omer of manna in it, and lay it up before the Lord to keep for your generations." This is the pot of manna that would eventually be put into the Ark of Covenant. It's a reminder of the provision that God had given as they wandered through the wilderness. Chapter 17. Chapter 17, there's more complaining to take place. Verse 1, that all the children of Israel set out on their journey from the wilderness of sin, according to the commandment of the Lord, and camped in Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. They've met this situation before, right? Last time was a little bit different. There was water, but it was bitter, and God caused the bitter water to become sweet, and they were able to drink it. This time, there's no water there at all from the sounds of it, and so did they learn the lesson? Now, we would hope that they would just simply come to the Lord, "Lord, there's no water. We need water." Verse 2, the people contended with Moses and said, "Give us water." There are so many better words that could have fit in there. The people petitioned Moses. The people asked Moses. But no, it's the people contended with Moses. And Moses' response to it: "Why do you contend with me? Why do you tempt the Lord? Why not just ask in faith? He is the same God who brought you out of Egypt after doing all those plagues in Egypt, brought you up out of Egypt, led you through the Red Sea, destroyed the Egyptian army. The God that you were singing to and saying how great he is and how powerful he is. He's the God who led you to Marah and gave you sweet water instead of bitter water. He's the God who every day rains down bread upon you and also provides quail in the evening. Maybe just ask." Verse 3, and the people thirsted there for water. Isn't that interesting? They get there and there's no water and they ask about the water. But it's not that they're asking, it's that they're demanding, they're contending. And so the Lord lets them thirst for a little while. What do you do when your child comes and your child demands that you do something right now? Well, you don't do it right now. And so God let them wait it out a little bit. The people thirsted there for water, and the people complained against Moses and said, "Why is it that you have brought us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" There they go, back to that whole thing. God brought us up to kill us. Does that really make sense? That God would go through all the things that he went through in order to bring them up out of Egypt just so that he could bring them out in the wilderness to kill them there. He saved them from bondage so he could kill them by thirst. It's nonsense. Verse 4, Moses cried out to the Lord, saying, "What shall I do with this people? They're almost ready to stone me." That's how bad things got. This is not the first time they've been that angry with Moses. Remember when they were going in, their elders going in to talk to Pharaoh and Moses was coming out, they, let the Lord judge you. How wicked you are, Moses. And they're going to come to this point at least a few more times where they would rather see Moses dead. What shall I do with this people? Verse 5, the Lord said to Moses, go on before the people and take with you the elders of Israel. Also take in your hand your rod which you struck the river, and go. Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock of Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water will come out of it, that the people may drink. And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. So he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah, because of the contention of the children of Israel, and because of they tempted the Lord, saying, is the Lord among us or not? Remember that rod that turned water into blood? Go take that. We'll get them some water. Again, God's patience with the people is astounding. Such simple things that they could just simply ask about, and they complain and attribute evil to the Lord, and he graciously supplies what they need. And so he provides water from the rock. This is the occasion when Moses is told to strike the rock. Remember, we're going to come to another occasion where he's to speak to the rock, and he doesn't do that. But he does what God says on this occasion, strikes the rock, and water comes out. And there are two names given to the place. Verse 7, the place is named, first of all, Massah. Massah means temptation. They have tempted the Lord here. And the second name, Meribah. Meribah means contention. They have tempted God and contended with God here. And then notice their statement in verse 7. What an awful statement for the people of God to make. Is the Lord among us or not? Why doesn't God do everything we want him to do before we want him to do it? Why isn't God continually at our beck and call? Did the Lord just take a break from us or something? The arrogance of such a statement. And the answer is both yes and no. Where did the sweet water come from? The Lord. Where did the quail and the manna come from? The Lord. Where does the water here come from? The Lord. Is the Lord among us? Yes, he is. Otherwise, you'd be dead in Egypt. But then think of it in a different way. Is the Lord among us? Do they accept him as their God? Not the way they're acting. Despite the fact that he is there and wants to be their God and them to be his people, that is not the way that they are acting here. 3 chapters, 3 complaints. And it doesn't stop here. It gets worse. This is not what you would expect from a people who had been redeemed from bondage and who are headed to a promised land. And yet that's the very thing that we see in the people of Israel. Some lessons for us out of this text. It is not becoming of the people of God to complain. For those who have been redeemed and have the hope of heaven, it makes no sense to be a bunch of complainers. Go over to Philippians 2, if you would. Philippians, the 2nd chapter, and we're going to go to verse 14 in the text. Paul talks about this complaining thing and how you and I should not. We'll start in verse 12. Philippians 2 and at verse 12. It says, therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, or not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you both to will and to do for his good pleasure. Do all things without complaining and disputing, that you may become blameless and harmless children of God, without fault in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world, holding fast the word of life, so that I may rejoice in the day of Christ, that I have not run in vain or labored in vain. Do all things without complaining. Anyone say that, yeah, that's exactly how I do things? We all seem to complain to some degree or another. He doesn't say do some things without complaining. He doesn't say do most things without complaining. Do all things without complaining and disputing. Again, I want us to understand, we talked about the parallel between us and Egypt, how they were a people in bondage. God brought them up out of bondage, and He's taking them to a promised land. You and I were a people in bondage. We were in sin, and God has brought us up out of sin by the blood of His Son. Again, blood was important under the old covenant with the Passover lamb. We've got our Passover lamb. He's brought us out of the bondage of sin, and He's conveying us to a promised land. Tell me what we have to complain about. Oh, well, life is difficult, you know. Things are hard at times. Yeah, I understand that. But how much greater is the hope that He sets before us than the things that we deal with in this life? Keep your finger there in Philippians, but go back with me to Romans chapter 8. Romans, the 8th chapter, verse 18. Paul says, I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. Paul says, you know, there's nothing to complain about, really. It's, you know, as difficult as life can be at times, when I set it against the hope of heaven, it really fails in comparison. There is no way to compare the two. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 16, therefore we do not lose heart, even though our outward man is perishing, yet the inward man is being renewed day by day. For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. While we do not look at the things which are seen, but the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporary, but the things which are not seen are eternal. Where's our eyes? What are we looking at? Paul says we don't look at the things which are seen, the things that are temporal, the things that are a light affliction for but a moment. Don't focus on that. You know what happens when we focus on that? We complain. That's what happens when that becomes our focus. But if instead of that we focus on the exceeding and eternal weight of glory, we focus on the things that are not seen, the things that are eternal, then the things that we would tend to complain about really fall to the wayside. Paul speaks in verse 17 of our light affliction. Our light affliction. Go over to chapter 11. 2 Corinthians chapter 11. Let me tell you about Paul's light affliction. Here's what he says, beginning at verse 23, middle part of 23. In labors more abundant, in stripes above measure, in prisons more frequently, in deaths often. From the Jews 5 times I received 40 stripes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I have spent in the deep. In journeys often, in perils of water, in perils of robbers, in perils of my own countrymen, in perils of the Gentiles, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren, in weariness and toil, in sleeplessness often, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, in cold and nakedness, besides the other things what comes upon me daily, my deep concern for all the churches. Who is weak, and I am not weak? Who is made to stumble, and I do not burn with indignation? If I must boast, I will boast in the things which concern my infirmity. The God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who is blessed forever, knows that I am not lying, and continues on to talk about even more that he went through. That's his light affliction. Anyone have a light affliction that even comes close to being in the same category as his? And as he writes this, understand he's not complaining. He's trying to give people perspective. I wonder if he's dealing with, again, this is written to Corinth so that you know that there were a bunch of complainers and disputers in Corinth. And maybe this gives them some perspective if they link this back to what he said in chapter 4 and at verse 16 through 18. All right, well, Paul went through that much and he continues to do so and willingly, then maybe we don't have a whole lot to complain. Back in Philippians 2 again. Do all things without complaining and disputing, that you may become blameless and harmless children of God in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. How exactly are we shining as lights if we're complaining like everybody else? We're supposed to be different. And part of that difference is that we acknowledge that our hope is not set here, that there's something much greater in store. And so if that's the case, then why do we complain about what's going on here as everybody else does? If we do that, then we can't be lights in the world. There's no distinction. Verse 16, he gives us the solution. Here's how we're going to have the right focus and not end up complaining about things that we just shouldn't be. He says, holding fast the word of life. Perhaps if we spent more time looking at what's in this book than we do looking at what's in the newspaper or on the news, on the TV, or what's in a Facebook feed, or if we spent more time in the word of life, then we'd have maybe less things to complain about and more things to share joy about. Holding fast the word of life, that I may rejoice in the day of Christ, that I have not run or labored in vain. He doesn't want us to be complainers. Drop back to 1 Corinthians for a moment, chapter 10. Again, it's the Apostle Paul writing, and this time he draws on our text over in Exodus. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 1. Moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware that all our fathers were under the cloud, all passed through the sea. Sound familiar? Talking about that generation coming up out of Egypt. All were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. All ate that same spiritual food. There's the manna. All drank that same spiritual drink, talking about the water coming from the rock. For they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. They didn't get all the imagery. They saw the things as they were happening in real time for them. Paul is saying there's some spiritual application to all these things that were going on. But, verse 5, with most of them God was not well pleased, for their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. Now these things became our examples, to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted. And do not become idolaters, as were some of them. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Nor let us commit sexual immorality, as some of them did. And in one day, 23,000 fell. We've not got to those things yet, but they're coming. Look at verse 9. Nor let us tempt Christ, as some of them tempted and were destroyed by the serpents. Nor complain, as some of them also complained and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now, we've not got to the destruction yet. God's been very patient with them so far. But he says, don't tempt Christ and don't complain. Moses, when he was talking to them, you've not complained against us, you're complaining against the Lord. Don't tempt the Lord. Verse 11, now all these things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the age have come. Why are we going back and checking out what old Israel did? Paul says these things became our example so that we don't do the same things. And so we need to be sure that we don't complain. Next thing, we have access to the true manna. They have bread falling down from heaven every morning. And that's manna. But go over to John chapter 6. John chapter 6, The feeding of the 5,000 is taking place here. And John gives us more details than what the other writers do. John tells us about the next day. And what happened on the next day? Well, the next day, the people tracked Jesus down and they were looking for another free meal. They weren't really interested in the preaching that he was doing. We can deal without that. But give us some more food. In fact, if you drop down in the text, look at verse 28. They said to him, "What shall we do that we may work the works of God?" Give us some food too. That's what they're there for. This is the work of God, that you believe in him who sent, in him whom he sent. Therefore they said to him, "What sign will you perform then, that we may see it and believe you? What work will you do?" We've got a suggestion. Our fathers ate the manna in the desert. After he gave them bread from heaven to eat. They're not there to hear the preaching. They're not there to really see a sign. If he rose somebody from the dead, they wouldn't care about that. Just give us more food. We enjoyed that meal yesterday. Then Jesus said to them, "Most assuredly I say to you, Moses did not give you bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world." Then they said to him, "Lord, give us this bread always." They're still thinking physical. They're thinking, "Oh, he's going to feed us. Yay, he's going to feed us." "I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall never hunger, and he who believes in me shall never thirst." And can't you just picture it? Among all the people. "Oh, I thought he was going to give us more bread." Drop down in the text to verse 48. He says again, "I am the bread of life. Your fathers ate the manna in the wilderness and are dead." How many of them are still around? They're all dead. "This is the bread which comes down from heaven, that one may eat of it and not die. I am the living bread which came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. And the bread that I shall give is my flesh, which I give for the life of the world." Remember, we talked about this, I believe, a few weeks ago. And some will use this and they'll talk about the Lord's Supper about it. That's not what this text is about. This text is about you and I partaking of Christ, living for Christ, giving our lives to him, and not just symbolically remembering what he sacrificed, but participating in his sacrifice. Making ourselves a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable to God, which is our reasonable service. This is about you and I faithfully serving him. That's what it means to partake of his bread, or of his body and of his blood. It's not just the emblems. We could do this every week. We could take these emblems every week and not be faithful servants of God. You cannot do what he's talking about here apart from being a faithful servant. This is participation in the cause of Christ. That's what he's dealing with in this text. And so we have the true manna. And so let's live in that way. They all died in the wilderness because that was not the true manna. The true manna is Jesus Christ who's come down from heaven. And so finally, remember the last thing that the people said in our text today. Is the Lord among us or not? What a sad thing for the people of God to say. Is God really here? Does God really care? But has that ever been the case maybe with us? I don't know. Is God really doing what he says he's going to do? Do we doubt the Lord's presence? Do we doubt the Lord's plan? You know, have we found times in our walk of faith where we're just ready to throw up our hands and quit? Those are the times when we're saying this same kind of thing. Is the Lord among us or not? And that's when we need to consider the greatness of God and all that he's done for us. We need to build our faith in God. We need to be convinced of his presence. He said, "Lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age." That is him saying, I'm always going to be there. We need to believe what he said. We need to be convinced of his plan through Jesus Christ to redeem us. He was taking these people to Canaan. That was the plan. That was God's plan when he sent Moses down. He's going to bring them up and take them to a land flowing with milk and honey. The fact that they died in the wilderness, that was their plan, not God's. That was, remember, he said a couple times already, I'm testing you to see if you'll keep my commandments, to see if you'll do what I want you to do. And they have failed and failed and failed. And these are simple commandments. These aren't hard ones. They chose to do their will instead of God's will, therefore they were scattered in the wilderness. The question is, what are you and I going to do? Will we choose to do God's will? And if we will, he'll take us to be with him in heaven. If we choose to do our will, the end result will be no different for us than for them. We'll be cast into hell. We'll see destruction. And so we need to choose what we're going to do. Is the Lord among us or not?